in 1996 to 1997. Sir is the only Indian Army officer who was a graduate of both Staff College Kimberley and USA Army War College. Sir was adjudged the best overseas student at Staff College Kimberley and awarded the gold medal at the Higher Command course. Sir's academic qualifications include PhD in Irregular Warfare, MPhil, double master's degree from Madras University and Pennsylvania, USA, and a diploma in management. It's a beautiful day here in Gandhinagar, and I warmly welcome you, sir. To pose a question to the participants, what is common between an Inca prince from South America and Kashmir? Sir will answer this question during the lecture. For scholars and students of defense, security, and strategic studies, today's lecture is going to be a very exciting one. Last lecture, sir gave us a comprehensive analysis of the valley till the year 1987. The time period between 1987 to 2002 was a tumultuous period for the region. With the Soviet Union retreating from Afghanistan, there was a vacuum to be filled in, and the Pakistan army launched a very devious plan called Operation Tupac. After the 2001 Parliament attacks, Operation Parakram was launched by India. In this lecture, we're looking at the timeline between the launch of Operation Tupac in 1988 and Operation Parakram in 2002. Lieutenant General Shah, sir, having had the privilege to serve the region of Jammu and Kashmir in key strategic positions at both times of war and peace, will be the most apt person to enlighten us about this timeline. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nirmal, for a very kind introduction and also putting the subject and its sequence in perspective. Just to pick up from where Nirmal has brought us to, last Wednesday we covered a huge, very, very wide span, starting from ancient times, coming all the way till the elections in 1987. And how, to start with, a place which historically had grown up to become a wonderful amalgam of Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam put together in a very unique culture called the Rishi culture, So that kind of uniqueness, that kind of, beautiful and syncretic जो आपस में मिलकर के जो बनता है, उस तरह का एक syncretic culture, how it was completely disrupted because of political ambitions, how it was completely upset because of all the devious, methods that followed the partition of India. And we also saw at length the 1947-48, 1965, 71, a war which was fought for liberation of Bangladesh, ultimately ended up in an agreement on J&K. And then, of course, we traced the entire, the political dimensions of the aspirations that were there from multiple directions, and ultimately how in 1987 the assembly elections, there were serious allegations of rigging and all, and that's how the whole movement, whole dimension changed from a political to a militant dimension. And so that is where we left it at 1987. And if you recollect, I had said this gentleman who's called Sayyid Salahuddin went by a different name earlier, and he was one of the contestants in the assembly elections. So there were allegations of rigging, and the Muslim United Front, MUF, felt that National Conference, supported by the powers in Delhi, Congress to be precise, had helped him to win out of turn without having actually got the people's mandate, and that's how it all unfolded. So today, like Nirmal has said, we are going to start from Op Tupac. I know this term may not be very familiar with you, but what is happening because of Op Tupac, all of you are familiar with. So you must know how it all started. That is one. And the second thing is we will take it all the way and just stop short of the 2002 assembly elections that took place. That we'll save for part 3 for the next occasion. So you see, what had happened is, because of the failure of Operation Gulmarg, I had mentioned it last time in 1947, when Pakistan realized that they are not being able to annex Kashmir the way they were trying. They did almost a similar thing called Operation Gibraltar in 1965, even that did not succeed. And ultimately, 71, we are aware of the humiliating defeat. I'll just digress for a minute. Next Wednesday on 16 December, we are organizing a wonderful event to commemorate the 16th December, and I will be talking a little more about it at the end of my talk. So getting back to the topic, after the defeat in 1971 and the humiliation that Pakistan had to go through, so then they started giving, thoughts to new concepts like strategic depth. That means they must have a grip over Afghanistan so that they are able to, add depth to their own country. If you look at the map of India and Pakistan, it comes out very clearly that Pakistan is like a narrow little thing. So therefore, they said, let us add strategic depth. And they spoke about nuclear deterrence, and all these new kinds of, new ideas started coming. So now I'll just take the help of a slide to explain the point that I'm just going to come to. It is around the same time Pakistan started a very, nascent, a new kind of Islamic insurgency in Afghanistan. At that point in time, the whole intention was, how can they overthrow the ruler of Afghanistan at that time, Daud Muhammad Khan, who was considered friendly to India and Soviet Union. So around the same time, because of the misrule which was there of the ruler, and around the same time, there was this Iranian revolution. So all this put together, Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan in 1979. When we do the Afghanistan series, we'll talk about this at length. So for now, just let's remain with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So now to counter the Soviet Union, what happened? The United States of America and Saudi Arabia, they empowered Pakistan to coordinate an Islamic insurgency. And so really speaking, that is how the beginning of jihad in our subcontinent started. So they empowered Pakistan to run a Islamic jihad against the Soviet Union and the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. So in order to do this against the Soviet Union and the PDPA, so they empowered Pakistan, US and Saudi Arabia to begin with, to run an Islamic insurgency over here. Now, this is something that actually Pakistan succeeded. And ultimately, as we are aware, Soviet Union had to withdraw. So once Soviet Union withdrew, so it was like for Pakistan, it was a vindication of jihad as an instrument of state policy. From a military perspective, it also helped them to take out two of their corps on the Western Front of Pakistan, meaning on this side, 11 and 12. And now when you see this map, let me quickly tell you, now this is the depth of Pakistan. So they felt that compared to India, how to add depth? So have control over Afghanistan so that you get strategic depth. So this is the meaning of strategic depth when we talk about in the context of Pakistan. So coming back to the point as it were. So after they succeeded in creating so much trouble for the Soviet Union and the PDPA government that it forced Soviet withdrawal, Pakistan thought now is the time, to vindicate, now is the time to pursue jihad as an instrument of state policy. Now I will show you my second slide. If you look at this, the gentleman over here is their president that time, Ziaul Haq. Now, towards the end of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan, they had made out a plan which they called Operation Topak. If you can read the slide in front of you. Now, when Zia addressed a meeting of people of the ISI, as you know, is Pakistan's primary intelligence agency, the inter-services intelligence. In April 1988, at a meeting of the ISI, this is what Ziaul Haq said. We have managed to accumulate large stocks of modern arms and ammunition from the US consignment, which was meant for the Afghan Mujahideen. And then he goes on to say, it would be disastrous to believe that we can take on India in a direct fight. We need to maintain a low profile so that Indians do not find an excuse to preempt us by attacking at a time and at a point of their choice. So effectively, they found this to be the better method of contesting India. And if you see it, ever since then, this is the strategy that Pakistan has consistently pursued with covert actions by ISI, remaining below the threshold of tolerance of India. That means India should not start a conventional war and also have the opportunity to keep denying it. So now, the other interesting part, which is not mentioned on the slide, what Zia said in the same speech, that, Kashmiris may not be naturally inclined to engage in warfare against foreign invaders, say like the Punjabi or the Afghan. Pakistan must be pragmatic about this and exploit the qualities of Kashmiris like their shrewdness, intelligence, perseverance, mastery of political intrigue. So he advocated that Pakistan should go for a synchronized application of moral and physical means besides military operations. So Ziaul Haq went on to say that it will be unrealistic to believe that MUF, that is Muslim United Front that I spoke about, or any such organization can seize power through democratic means. So therefore, Pakistan must influence matter in a manner that their favorite politicians are manipulated to win elections in India and subvert the structures of the state. Now I'll go to the next slide. Now this Operation Topak was supposed to be conducted in 3 phases. In phase 1, the idea was to start, Pakistan's idea was to start a low-level insurgency so that they do not cross the threshold of the government of India to impose governor's rule in J&K. So what they wanted is to basically penetrate, infiltrate key positions in police, in the banks, in the telecommunications, and so that all these organizations could be subverted. And after that, they would undertake a disruption of the lines of communication between the 3 parts, that is the Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh, and by using covert means. And the whole idea was they are able to establish a virtual control in areas where the army is not deployed. So from a Kashmir point of view, basically it meant areas of South Kashmir is where they wanted to get control and create such terror and mayhem in coordination with the extremism, Sikh extremism movement that was going on in Punjab that time, that they would make it chaotic for India. So that was the idea in phase 1. In phase 2, they said we should create military pressure. That means put pressure along the line of control in Kargil, in Rajouri, Poonch area. And last time I had used one more term called AGPL, if you remember, actual ground position line in Siachen. So put such military pressure that India will be compelled to take out the reserve formations. Like in the army, when we deploy a certain number of troops and we keep some troops as reserve for any contingency to deal कोई अगर इस तरह के हालात हो जाए, कोई situation आ जाए, so for that the reserve formations are kept over there. So they wanted the reserve formations to move out of Kashmir so that they could, carry on with their plans for disrupting the communications, attacking the logistics bases at different places. And they thought that they will be able to disrupt the situation so much that by pushing in some of the Afghan Mujahideen who had now become free because Soviet Union had withdrawn from Afghanistan, they will be able to infiltrate into J&K and they will be able to increase the influence of Pakistan. And towards the end, the whole aim was they will create some sort of special forces comprising of this Afghan Mujahideen led by retired officers of Azad Kashmir units, or what we call in India the Pakistan occupied Kashmir units. If you remember last time I had said how they cheated the UN agreement to raise 32 Azad Kashmir or POK battalions, Pakistan occupied Kashmir battalions, to strike at airfields, to strike at Banihal, the pass through which Kashmir Valley is connected, Kargil Leh highway, radio stations, and so on. I'm explaining this at some length so that you understand what is the thought process behind Pakistan's involvement in J&K. And by the same time, they also said that we must apply uh, so much pressure on Punjab and the adjacent areas of Jammu that it becomes untenable. मतलब मुश्किल हो जाए इंडिया के लिए to keep this area under their control. And as far as the phase 3 is concerned, the aim was very clear: liberation of J&K. Although he did not give out Zia did not give out the details that time, but he said that I will let you know the plans later. But the important thing is you must do it quickly because it is not as if you have enough time. So the whole intention was they should be able to achieve phase 1 and phase 2 before the general elections of India were held in 1989. And the other thing, for those of you who remember it, sometimes we'll study this also. At that time, India had about 4 divisions deployed in Sri Lanka as part of the India and the Sri Lankan Accord. So Indian peacekeeping force was there. So they said with 4 divisions of India in Sri Lanka, India can now be pressurized by combining this trouble in J&K and Punjab. So therefore, he said that the whole action must be quite time-bound. The other thing, interesting part, he said that, I had spoken a little while back about what was Zia's impression of the Kashmiris. So then he says that as far as Kashmir is concerned, we have to look for a combination of something like the Intifada. You must have seen the people's protest and so on, which was happening in Palestine in those days. It will have to be a combination of Intifada and like the Afghan war in the rural areas in Kashmir. That's what he thought in the metros, Intifada, in the towns and city, Intifada, and in the rural Afghan Mujahideen kind of fight. Okay, now let's come to what Ziaul Haq felt the international support. It is given in the slide in front of you. Look at it. This is happening in 1989. He was quite sure that China will tie down Indian forces along the China-India border. So on the one side, the calculation was Indian forces will be stuck in Sri Lanka. On the other side, China will tie down Indian forces in Sri Lanka. And then he goes on to say that if we are in serious trouble, the Chinese and other powerful friends, who are these powerful friends? He was hinting at US, he was hinting at Saudi Arabia. And maybe not UK, but definitely these 2 countries will come to the rescue one way or the other. And they will ensure that if we do not, we meaning Pakistan, if we do not win, we will at least not lose. Look at the, way they were thinking. So, really speaking, around this time, Pakistan was very, very clear how they want to take the future of this entire issue of J&K. And in the process, they started the activities that they were thinking of. First, how did the irregular war start? How did the, shall we say, militancy start? I think if you have to put a date to it, after the assembly elections, as I told you, it transformed from a political to an militant movement. So in March 1988, some blast took place at the telegraph office in Srinagar. I think this is the beginning. And basically, it is the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front and Muslim Jamaah's force that were at that time the front of Pakistan's proxy war against India. So now, as I was showing to you in the very first slide, so on this side, they had started the trouble in Srinagar. On the other side, Soviet Union was withdrawing from Afghanistan, and now they could, put their entire energy with all their weapons, ammunition, which they had, which was meant for the Afghan, the jihad in Afghanistan, they would be diverting it here. So then you could see the situation slowly starting to deteriorate. Now let us go to 1989 with the help of a slide and see, how things started to unfold. So again, I'll take you back to the slide. So here we are. Okay. So on 14th August, actually, one day before the date which is given over there, for the first time, we saw Pakistani flags on top of some of the important buildings in Kashmir. So what is that indication? That means that subversion or the infiltration which they were wanting to do, that they had done. And on 15th August 1989, Independence Day, a radio station called Voice of Islamic Republic of Kashmir started to do its broadcast. So normally, these are the indications, that things are getting, that how much things are getting complicated and how much they had been able to penetrate into the people in such a short time. So which shows that somewhere, I think as a country, we were assuming that just pure democratic process alone will be able to take care of the situation. So that realization was slowly dawning. And now more indications were coming. For example, they were able to create a divide in the Jammu and Kashmir police between the Kashmiri and the non-Kashmiri. So much so that the state machinery had almost come to a standstill. On the one side was this divide in the police. On the other side, they were able to organize protests by the population. More importantly, they were able to organize a strike by the truck drivers. Kashmir, as we had told you in part 1, is by and large, most of the activity happens during the summer months. So if during the summer months, as we are seeing in around August, September 1989, if the truckers were to go on a strike, the complete life of Kashmir, and if you go beyond up to Ladakh, can be completely disrupted. So these kind of strikes, etc., started taking place. And we could see more militancy coming in. Like one of the civilian trucks which were hired for the army were attacked by them. The ammunition dump of the army in Bandipur was attacked. There was an attack on the airfield in Srinagar, an attack on the airfield in Avantipur. So all kinds of these activities were going on. And I think the final strike, as I look at it, was when two of these gentlemen, very very renowned Kashmiri people, Kashmiri Pandits actually, very renowned people. One was Tikalal Taplu. Tikalal Taplu was a lawyer by profession, and he was also the chief of the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party in Kashmir that time. He was assassinated, and Neelkant Ganju, who was the additional sessions judge in Srinagar, he was killed by the terrorists. So this picture is you see of Neelkant Ganju, and this is that unfortunate picture of the sessions judge after he was assassinated. So now they assassinated him. Why? Because he is the person who had pronounced the judgment on Maqbool Bhatt to be hanged. If you remember last time I had mentioned to you about that, the aircraft, the Indian Airlines aircraft Ganga, which was hijacked on the way from Srinagar to Delhi and taken to Lahore, and the person who had claimed responsibility was Maqbool Bhatt. So Justice Neelkant Ganju had given him the life sentence. So this was their way to take revenge. And apart from this, number of other protests in different parts of Kashmir. There was a protest by the Jammu and Kashmir police, as I said, and a lot of people started rallying around that United Nations Military Observer Group I had mentioned to you of India, Pakistan. So under these circumstances, situation went out of control. As you can see, the first bullet on your slide, in January, February 1990, almost in 2 months, 1,62,500 Kashmiri Pandits left the Kashmir Valley, came down to Jammu, Delhi, and so on. On 25th January 1990, one day before the Republic Day, 4 Indian Air Force personnel who were unarmed and they were killed by the terrorists near Rawalpura. And the fellow who was accused of that killing is nobody else but Mr. Yasin Malik, who still roams around free. It's only now that some actions have been taken against him. Otherwise, for so many years, he was roaming around free. Okay, so that was the killing of the 4 IF people. And so once these 2 actions took place, on 16th April 1990, the government of India took a decision to ban some of these militant outfits like Jamaat-e-Islami, Hizbul Mujahideen, Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, Mahaji Azadi, and so on, Islamic Students League, People's League, Islamic Jamaatul Tawa, and so on. All told, 147 schools which are run by the Falah-e-Aam Trust, that means Goodness for the People, supported by Jamaat-e-Islami, were closed. And these students, 15,000 students who were studying in these schools, were given admission in government schools. So that is the kind of actions the government took. But despite that, the situation, continued to go out of hand, as given in the slide in front of you. The Vice Chancellor of Srinagar University, his name was Khara, the manager of Hindustan Machine Tools. It's a lovely complex which is there just on the outskirts of Srinagar. Mr. Khara, he was killed. The VC of Srinagar University, Mushirul Haq, he was killed. The Doordarshan station manager, Lassa Kaul, was killed. So like this, one after the other. And Mirwais Farooq, who was the moderate leader, father of the current one of the separatist leaders, he was assassinated on 21st May 1990, almost bringing an end to moderate voices in Kashmir. So under these circumstances, on 5th July 1990, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was imposed in Kashmir. Quite often you will hear this term more often used as an abbreviation called AFSPA. AFSPA stands for Armed Forces Special Powers Act. This was imposed under these circumstances because the situation was completely disturbed. So that is how the army got deployed. So then the army, once they got deployed, they went in for a straightforward three-pronged strategy. You can see on your slide in front of you. First was to carry out counter-infiltration. Now this is to happen along the line of control so that the terrorists from Pakistan side cannot infiltrate into India, and the youth from Kashmir, swayed by ISI, attracted by ISI with all kinds of incentives, do not exfiltrate, मतलब हिंदुस्तान से पाकिस्तान की तरफ ना जा सके, infiltrate from Pakistan occupied Kashmir, into India, Jammu and Kashmir, or if people exfiltrating from here to that side. So that is the meaning of infiltration and exfiltration. And in the valley, army started counter-terrorism actions. And third action was military-civic action, which is also later on started getting called Sadbhavna, so that some sort of goodwill is maintained and this sense of alienation, jo log khafa hote hai, how to reduce that sense of alienation. Despite all these, immediate actions by the army, still incidents continued. And major incidents I have written over here. Time does not allow me to explain each one. You can see it on your slide. So number of activities took place. You see the name of Hazrat Bal Shrine appearing twice over there. This is nothing new. Every time you see it, there are people, there are elements who start supporting the terrorists. And one of the easiest things that they do is they come and take shelter in these shrines, because as armed forces of our country, except some incidents in Punjab that I will talk about when we talk about the Punjab series, for now, after that lessons learned, basically, to the extent possible, India's armed forces, when I say armed forces, it includes the police, they try to avoid entering any religious place, and it is dealt with separately. So they come and take shelter over here. So if you see 3 times, they tried to seize the Hazrat Bal Shrine, 92, 93, and again in October 1993, which was the longest one, longest duration this siege took place. The sad part was at that time, the governor of Jammu and Kashmir, he had a certain different idea. The administrator of Kashmir, that is the Divisional Commissioner of Kashmir, he had a different idea. And the police had a different idea, army had a different way of dealing with it. So this siege, unfortunately, carried on for very long, which gave people, opportunity to rise against that. the significance of Hazratbal Shrine is, why people are so charged, why people are so emotional. Because in this shrine, it is believed that the holy relic, the holy relic meaning the hair of the Prophet, uh, peace be upon him, is kept over here. So therefore, this place has a lot of importance, a lot of significance. It's sensitive about this. So basically, what had happened is, that inside the shrine, somebody had tampered with the locks that were leading to the room in which the holy relic is kept. So first was, they tried to isolate the mosque by blocking all exit and entry routes by sending the BSF. Then army was sent in. And at this time in Delhi, Prime Minister was quite busy. Narasimha Rao was quite busy with elections. And nobody wanted to, upset the thing, as I said. So a cordon was laid. The idea was, okay, don't enter the holy shrine. Let the terrorists wear themselves out by cutting off their supplies, by cutting off their water, and so on, by cutting off the electricity. Unfortunately, what happened, even till the third day, despite the cordon, the instructions which were given to the administration, the civilian administration, that the water and electricity has to be cut off, that was not implemented. So either it was happening because of difference in views between the governor, divisional commissioner, police, and the armed forces and the military army, or perhaps somebody could have got somebody would have been subverted. मतलब उसकी जो है loyalty change करवा दी होगी. Whatever be the case, it didn't get implemented. So therefore, even if the cordon was there, it was not making an effect the way we wanted. And side by side, they kept carrying on the negotiation with the terrorists who were hiding over there. Ultimately, the terrorists used this opportunity to build bunkers inside, and they started laying explosives and threatening that if you don't leave us, we will blow up the shrine, knowing fully well that if that shrine was blown up, there will be furious reaction from the population. Anyway, so after some time, finally the water and the electricity was cut up and negotiations started. And eventually on the public started a major rally at that time. So on 22nd October, in one of the rallies that was taking place all the way in South Kashmir, in a place called Bijbehara near Anantnag, the BSF had to open fire. And in that fire, 37 people died and 70 people were injured. So the whole situation, completely turned and it went out of control. Anyway, so finally on 16th November 1993, the terrorists were given a safe passage to come out and surrender. But the point is, a lot of lessons were learned from this to deal with the future. And we will see it when we come to the next slide, in which I'm talking about the siege of Charar-e-Sharif, which is another holy shrine, which is there in South Kashmir. So here you see, by the first week of March 1995, from December 1994, these terrorists were entering this place. By the first week of March 1995, it was estimated that about 75 terrorists are hiding inside the Charar-e-Sharif shrine. So this time, unlike the situation in Hazratbal, the terrorists also knew that army is going to deal with it differently. Okay, so therefore they tried to build up their logistic support in advance over here. The other thing which I must point out over here, that Charar-e-Sharif, you may be wondering, okay, if the terrorists are entering it, why should the armed forces be hesitant? I must tell you, as far as the terrorists are concerned, they don't care too much about these Sufi shrines. If they did indeed care, so why would they in the first place enter it? And if you see the history from the Afghanistan side, especially the foreign terrorists who came here, they were entering Sufi shrines in Afghanistan at will, and they were desecrating them. So therefore, I don't think they, sort of follow the same norms that we are sort of following. Anyway, after seeing after the experience of Hazrat Bal, this time the army decided that they will put a cordon, a reasonably strong cordon, but cover a much wider area. And so they decided to go outside the periphery of the town and put the cordon. This town was not very big. I mean, for anybody who has been there, you must have seen, I've been there a number of times. The population at that time was just around 20,000 people. And by and large, about 200 buses carrying people come from various places, like you see in any of the temples here. So about 200 buses would come every day. People would come, give their prayers, go back. So basically, it was a small township which was built around this shrine, which around the Sufi shrine. Anyway, in response to the army cordon and preparing for an eventuality that the shrine may be stormed, that means फौज वहां पे आ जाएगी, the terrorists ने क्या किया? They started making their defenses over there. उन्होंने वहां पे bunkers बनाए, आसपास में mines लगा दी, कुछ ID हम लोग बोलते हैं improvised explosive device वो लगा दी. And throughout, they were in communication with their leader, Hizbul Mujahideen, through radio sets and things like that. Now, finally, to avoid the possibility of the terrorists blowing up the shrine, because the armed forces, the army on this side was thinking that, what if the terrorists blow up the shrine and what effect it will have on the overall situation? So they decided, okay, fine, give an opportunity for a peaceful resolution by offering safe passage. So when this offer was given कि आप surrender कर लो, इनके आपस में थोड़ी बहुत फूट हो गई, and Harkatul Ansar, who were mostly the foreign terrorists, basically, they were the ones who were resisting, and Hizbul Mujahideen was more or less ready to enter into negotiation. But one way or the other, they decided that we will not. The terrorists decided they will hold on till they get some directions from their headquarters, which is called the Markaz. So finally, on 19th March 1995, the CRPC section 144, जिसको हम लोग curfew बोलते हैं, that was promulgated over here. So those buses that were carrying people in and out, that had to be stopped, and other people were also prevented from entering the town. But one mistake that was made over here, that the media was also not allowed. Because the media was not allowed, so the truth actually didn't come out, and because of the truth did not come out, in the absence of information, the terrorists succeeded in, spreading propaganda to say that उनके ऊपर बड़ा, अत्याचार हो रहा है, and all kinds of rumor mongering started. So ultimately, people from this place, I said population around 20,000, most of them left, and about only 1,000 were left. So ultimately, once the population had come down, the terrorists decided to break, out of this cordon of the army. So an exchange of fire started in early May, and in that, exchange of fire that took place, their leader, there is one Mr. Mastgul, he asked his terrorists to assemble in the shrine, and they offered prayers at about 8:30 at night, and at the same time they put some houses in one of the muhalla, not in the shrine proper, in one of the muhallas which was adjoining. They put it on fire, and then because of the wind which was blowing around that time, the fire almost covered half the town before the morning. And by 10th May 1995, there were some explosions towards the rear of what is called the Khanka Mosque. And finally, at about 2 a.m. on 11th May, army troops in the cordon observed that this shrine was on fire. Now, when by this time, because of the circumstances, they received the army got the authority to, as I said, those IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which were there. In that operation, 20 terrorists were killed, 23 IEDs were removed, and 2 small workshops were found where people were being trained to use and sort of fabricate the IEDs. Over the next 3 days, starting from 11th May, more terrorists were killed. Army also lost 2 of the soldiers, and it is believed that Mastgul escaped in one of the firefighting vehicles. But once the fire broke out, a fire tender was going inside. So I think he managed to hide in that fire tender, which was brought in on 8th, 9th May, that he was able to escape. So in this entire process, again, we learned some lessons that whenever you carry out such operations, it is important to have the media so that the people know what is happening inside. There is no point trying to block information. I think that was an important thing. And also, the other thing was, I think, the whole operation was far too prolonged, and at different stages, different forces, agencies were coming in. So that was the second major lesson which was learned. Anyway, by this time, it was quite clear that the government of India is trying to follow a strategy. I told you about the army strategy a little while back. Government of India was trying to follow a strategy which I think had four basic fundamentals. That okay, start wearing out the terrorists now, and you basically start wearing out the terrorists in such a manner, and side by side see what measures can be taken so that people return to their normal life in terms of agriculture, trade, education, and so on. And side by side, army should carry out its counter-infiltration and counter-terrorist. Written on the slide is CT, which stands for counter-terrorist operations, and overall internationally try to isolate Pakistan. Now, when this was happening, what Pakistan started doing is to confuse the Indian establishment. They started creating newer and newer groups, because if the intelligence was coming on Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, so they would start diverting resources to prop up Badhawa dete the Hizbul Mujahideen ko. When the armed forces or the security forces were putting pressure on the Hizbul Mujahideen, they propped up another group called the Harkatul Ansar. So like this, basically what they were doing is, one, making it difficult for the intelligence agencies to get hold of these terrorists, and slowly they were inducting more and more Islamic fundamentalist elements into the terror mechanism that they were having in JNK. That happened at famous or infamous. There is one nice book also which came out some time back, that 6 foreign tourists were kidnapped from the area of Pahalgam, and this was supposed to have been done by the Al-Farhan group, which was nothing else but a faction of the Harkatul Ansar I mentioned in the previous slide. So now these kidnappers, they demanded the release of Maulana Masood Asar. You will keep hearing his name. He is the fellow who founded Jaish-e-Mohammed, and I will talk about him in a short while, a little more. And they wanted the release of Maulana Masood Asar and 20 other terrorists. And so because they had kidnapped foreign tourists, so that they thought that there will be a lot of pressure from the countries concerned, that is Germany, Norway, UK, and USA. And their embassies in Delhi, they tried all kinds of methods to put pressure on the government. They started talking directly to the Hurriyat, the separatist people, to secure their release. So in this, all kinds of complications came, but ultimately these foreign terrorists were killed sometime in December 1995. The exact dates are not known, but that is what it is assessed. And ultimately on 24th March 1996, when 9 terrorists were killed in an encounter, and 2 JKP armed policemen were also lost in the fight, it is believed that these terrorists who were involved in this kidnapping were eliminated over here. So under these circumstances, apart from this major incident, otherwise, if you were to see overall, the situation was beginning to, shall we say, get a new normal of stability, and under which circumstances they decided to go ahead and hold the elections. So in May, they had the parliamentary elections. The voter turnout was just about 20%. In September 1996, they had the assembly elections, in which the turnout went up to 56%. So this, people thought that the silent majority has got a chance to reject militancy. So that was a sense of optimism over there. From a military perspective, the number of terrorist operations, number of terrorists in the valley also dropped from 10,000 to 3,000. And you could hear statements like this written in the slide in front of you from the likes of Farooq Abdullah to bring in some semblance of sense in what was happening over there. So let me just highlight a point over here. This applies even today. If you see this part of your slide, I've put three circles and written religion, economy, and politics. In Kashmir, my experience is whenever the religious passion declines, people start thinking about economic issues and they start thinking about politics. They want to renew the political process. So if the economics and politics can be kept, this was a question which was asked of me last time, and if you are to focus on development, we'll be able to take care of this problem. Given the same answer last time, I thought it appropriate to talk about it now because we are talking about a much more, advanced situation. So whenever the religious passion can be calmed down, you see economics and politics coming into the forefront, which is an indication that things can be changed, things can be improved. So around this time, because of the international situation, that was prevailing, on the one side, China was showing signs of aggression along the border. They were actively supporting Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. And why were they doing it? Because they wanted to contain the Soviet Union. Today, Russia and China are showing that they have become friends. That time they were very much rivals, and actually China was working with the blessings very much of the US, and we'll talk about it in some other forum later. So that is how, in order to contain that, India realized that we need to have stronger deterrence. That means, so we'll talk about deterrence and all when we in a different topic. For now, you must understand that आपके पास इतनी काबिलियत होनी चाहिए कि अगला आपके ऊपर हमला करने से घबराए. So that is in short deterrence. So India decided that we should have stronger deterrence. So between 11th and 13th May 1998, 5 nuclear tests were carried out by India, and within exactly 15 days, Pakistan carried out 5 nuclear tests, equal number, on 28th May 1998. So again, a new kind of a normal developed. And in September 1998, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, as you know, UN General Assembly meets in September every year, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, they had a discussion and they agreed on some confidence building measures. And this was followed by the Lahore bus, that famous Sada-e-Sarhad bus. You can see the image on your slide. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, accompanied by Shatrughan Sinha and the likes, they traveled to Lahore by the first, shall we say, a bus which was going from Delhi to Lahore. So this, in this bus journey, what they called Sada-e-Sarhad, they reached over there and they signed the Lahore Declaration, which was nothing else but a commitment to peace, stability, and all over there. So on the one side, this is what the political leaders, that is Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Nawaz Sharif, were trying to do. But on the ground, the situation was turning out to be pretty different. And how was it turning out to be pretty different? So let's go to the next slide. All of you must have heard of Kargil. So if you see here in February, we were doing the Sada Sarhad, hoping peace, creating so much of hype about peace. What the Pakistan army was doing was, they had come and occupied these heights about Kargil, Dras, in this area and all. On some other occasion, we will talk about the operations of Kargil in detail. But the point to remember is they wanted to dominate this because they thought that by dominating this main road that goes from Srinagar all the way to Leh, they will be able to dominate this and, again revive the proxy war. So in many ways, what we had discussed in the very beginning, that opt to pact, they were trying to play it out that, okay, fine, if the two prime ministers are trying peace, then add to the problems of India by making this occupying these heights over here, because in order to deal with Kargil, what will happen? India will have to reduce the forces in Kashmir. If the forces are reduced from Kashmir and sent to Kargil, there will be a void over here. Into that void, what will happen? The terrorists will create more mayhem. So, once the terrorists create more mayhem, they will be able to come and achieve exactly what they had thought about in the Octopact. So, that was the broad plan. So, they thought, they will be able to upset the situation more, and well, also in the process, they will be able to internationalize once again the Kashmir issue. So now, for the rest of Pakistan's border with India, they adopted a sort of a defensive offensive posture. We'll not go into details of that. They deployed their forces to deal with the contingency that India might open up along the international border, as you have seen what we had done in 1965 and so on. So this is how the situation happened in Kargil. What I have written over here is this nuclear hubris. Hubris ka matlab hota hai ki, it gives you a sort of an arrogance of power. आपके अंदर इतना घमंड आ जाता है कि you think nothing can go against you. So because of that nuclear blast that had taken place 1 year back, so Pakistan thought that now India knows we are a nuclear armed country, so they will do nothing against us. So therefore, they will get away with something like this. How they were removed from here, at what kind of war fighting and what kind of casualties, we'll talk about it when we discuss Kargil in a separate session. So now, very quickly, now let's come to the early 2000s. Now that we have spoken about the Kargil part. So after getting this response in Kargil, now Pakistan had to think of newer ways to sort of inflame the situation which is over there. So what could they do? One is on 24 December 1999, the ISI, they managed to use terrorists to hijack again another Indian Airlines flight, which was on its way from Kathmandu to Delhi. They first managed to hijack it, take it. They landed for a short while in Amritsar. That is another long story. After landing in Amritsar, it lifted again, went towards UAE, and finally came and landed in Kandahar. So this hijacking was done by the Harkatul Mujahideen, which was nothing else but the new named Harkatul Ansar, supported by Pakistan. The hijack and the captivity of the passengers continued for 7 days, and there was so much pressure on the government of India that ultimately the government decided to release the 3 terrorists. I had mentioned Maulana Masood Azhar, whose demand was there when they had captured when they had taken those foreign tourists as captives. So they wanted him released that time. This time they succeeded, and government of India released Maulana Masood Azhar, and he went on to form, as I said, the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And very recently, you may recall, the Pathankot base, Air Force base attack was masterminded by the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And there were 2 more terrorists, Omar Saeed Sheikh and Mustaq Ahmad Zargar, were released. On 20th March 2000, just before President Clinton's visit, there was a massacre of Sikhs. There is a small percentage of Sikh population that is there in Kashmir Valley, in a place called Chitsinghpura. So now the whole purpose was to demonstrate to President Clinton that you cannot forget the Kashmir issue, and things have to take place. And this was followed by a car bomb attack outside headquarters, 15 Corps in Srinagar, where the PRO, he died. So like this, number of incidents kept taking place, and ultimately, I think on 22nd December 2000, the attack took place in Delhi's Red Fort. Despite that, Prime Minister Vajpayee was still hoping that peace could come. So we had this Agra summit between the President of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, and our Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Over there, the talks failed. All the proposals to decrease nuclear arsenal in Kashmir, cross-border terrorism, nothing succeeded, and ultimately, once the talks failed, then people realized that actually Pakistanis are never serious about whatever they are doing. And why I state that, A, you have seen following Lahore declaration was Kargil. When Kargil we were able to deal with militarily all this series of incidents which are written in front of you on the slides. Despite that, Prime Minister Vajpayee tried the Agra summit but did not succeed. Let's go away from Kashmir and go to US for a while. We all keep hearing about 9/11, 9/11. 9/11 is nothing but because Americans put it the other way around. So therefore, on this, my mistake, it should have read 11 September. On the slide, should have read 11 September. So once this 9/11 attacks took place on the World Trade Center, as you can see over here in New York, and also attacks on Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and when all these terrorist attacks on US, which was carried out with aircrafts behaving like missiles, suddenly, when all of it got traced back to Pakistan, the world woke up to realize what India was going on saying for so long, on and on. But anyway, this realization came, and this sort of emboldened Pakistan's ISI of their immense capabilities. And so they started, raising the stakes more. And on 1st October 2001, they carried out an attack on the J&K Assembly. And immediately after that came the attack on our parliament. We have to see the linkages. After 9/11, that is the 11th September 2001 attack on the World Trade Center in New York, the UN Security Council, they adopted a resolution in which basically it was asking all states to refrain from providing any form of support to people who may be directly or indirectly engaged in terrorism. So because of all this pressure, so they had to show the reactions, so they said, okay, fine. On the one side, they joined the so-called Global Coalition Against Terrorism. And on the other side, they said, in the garb of freedom movement, they started to intensify what is happening in J&K. Today, it is another matter. If you see, people have woken up to this also. But the point is, at that time, they managed to fool the larger, shall we say, decision makers of the world. And ultimately, they carried out the 13 December 2001 attack on the Parliament of India. This attack, as you can see these pictures over here, this is the J&K Assembly attack, and this is the attack on the Parliament of India, in which 9 people died, including 8 security personnel, Parliament security personnel, and 1 civilian died. And because of this Pakistan-sponsored attack, India mobilized its forces along the entire border under an operation called Op Parakram. And really speaking, this was the first time when India had mobilized its forces to retaliate against a terrorist attack. And so therefore, initially, there was pressure on Pakistan. And on 12 January 2002, primarily under pressure, I think, from the US, General Musharraf, he made a speech promising to transform his country to a moderate Islam country. But Pakistan being what it is, the moment the pressure of an attack from India, moment the threat of an attack from India came down, they came back to their old tricks on 14th May 2002. 3 terrorists who were, masquerading as army men, they entered the army camp at a place called Kaluchak in Jammu by traveling in a bus, and they carried out a massacre in the family quarters, killing 41 people, including 10 children and and 8 women, all family members of army personnel in Kaluchak. 10 civilians and 47 others were also wounded. Very shortly after that, on 6 July 2002, once again Musharraf pledged, because again India was wanting to go in, but Musharraf pledged that he would dismantle all terrorist camps. But barely 2 months later, 13 July, they carried out another attack on 27 laborers in a slum near Jammu called Qasim Nagar. Almost a similar story, masquerading as Hindu Pandits. They entered the settlement, lobbed grenades, killing all these 24 people on the spot. 3 people died later. So that's how the whole story carried on. So for now, I'm deliberately stopping it here a little abruptly to tell you, to leave you with this thought that no matter how many times India has tried to follow the path of peace, but Pakistan, this just doesn't seem to work. So therefore, we will stop over here, and in the next part, we will take on from 2002 and beyond. So it's just a little over an hour that I have spoken, and I will stop here, hand it back to Nirmal Matthews to take questions from the people, if any. So what do you, Nirmal?
Thank you so much, sir. It was quite an insightful lecture, and the talk on the various aspects of the timeline were quite interesting, sir. Thank you so much, sir. If there are any questions for Lieutenant General Subrata Saha, sir, you may ask via the chat box, or you may ask the question directly to Saha, sir, as well.
Nirmal, I think you'll have to give them a cue.
Right, sir. Right, sir.
Nirmal is also completely quiet. Either the entire story has, has got lost somewhere.
No, of course not, sir. It was,
or it is just a lot of information that has come in front of you. Well, either ways, I think what we have to remember from this is, whatever all these, problems of terrorism, problems of insurgency, militancy that we are seeing, these things don't happen overnight. You have to see how progressively the political process fails. After the political process fails, aspirations of people are not met. When aspirations of people are not met, economics start getting affected. In the absence of, unfulfilled political aspirations, in the absence of, economic aspirations not being met, other factors, other forces come into play, and they come and start disrupting the situation. That is exactly how, this business of militancy, this business of terrorism start thriving. So in many ways, if we are able to solve our internal problems ourselves, and when I say solve, it has to be solved much quicker than what we are used to. So therefore, somewhere if you see, there is a failing from within the country as well. It's all very well that Pakistan has done what it has done. Nobody can ever absolve them for this kind of cross-border crime, cross-border crimes, cross-border terrorism, what have you. But the fact is, there were enough fault lines. हमारे अंदर बहुत खामियां थी, हमारे अंदर बहुत कमजोरियां थी, जिसको इन्होंने फायदा उठाया है. They have taken advantage and they have done what they have done. So therefore, if you see it, it is the fertile grounds are given because of our own inefficiency, because of our own inability to look after the people, as it were. So therefore, if you comprehend this, it will be easier for you to understand the situation which is today. Because sometimes when we see the current situation, things going out of hand, we get very upset without realizing how did the whole thing, unfold, how did it evolve, why people have thought the way they have thought. Now, sitting here, it's very difficult to, get into the mind of a Kashmiri. If you remember, in one of my very early slides, I had shown you how geographically the whole area is bounded by mountains from all sides. So as it is psychologically, there is an isolation. On top of it, because of that psychological isolation, if there is a sense that, okay, there is governor's rule, we are being ruled directly from Delhi, our leaders are not there. So that geographical isolation and this political situation, they start fueling each other, making the situation worse. So there are a whole lot of factors that come into play. As long as this thing you are comprehending slowly and gradually, I think we are building a very strong base to be able to understand these situations and take up a lot more in this field and go into more depths. So yes, once again, if there is any discussion, any question, quite okay. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Right, sir. That was the right observation, sir. Kashmir is called a prisoner of geography, and I think after repeal of Article 370 is no longer prisoner of polity. But I think it will take some more time for the Kashmiris to understand how the polity is changing and how it's for their benefit that Article 370 was repealed. So it would take some time, sir. Shruti has a comment, sir. She said, "Thank you so much, sir. Your way of explaining the cause behind the events and linking them so comprehensively is really great." There was a comment, sir, from Shruti Singh. Ujjwal Tiwari has a question, sir. Today, army is carrying out operations all out in Kashmir, but the root cause is in POK. Why does army hesitate to carry out operations in POK?
It's a very good question which has come from very good question which has come. I think it is from Ujjwal Tiwari.
Ujjwal, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Why I say it's a very good question? Because I would go even beyond POK. POK is only the geographical point from where the problem is the problem is emanating. Actually, it is Islamabad. It is because Pakistan, for its own reasons, wants to keep the Kashmir issue boiling, because Pakistan, if you see, it has increasingly become a very interesting situation of a state or a country which is owned by the army. In all other countries, you will see, like India owns an army. In Pakistan, it is the other way around. The country belongs to the army. Okay, I'm trying to make this very clear distinction, because unless and until they keep propagating India as their enemy, what is the reason for Pakistan army to exist? Now, by doing this slowly, gradually, they have managed to get China also with them, because India perceives China as a threat. So therefore, we are seeing this joining of hands. In fact, only last week, if you see, an act has been passed in the Pakistani parliament. An act has been passed according to which this China-Pakistan economic corridor, for that they have created an authority, like you have the Delhi Development Authority. So like that, you've got an authority which has been created. Now this authority is comprising of people from Pakistan Army, and they are above the law of the land. That means they are above parliamentary scrutiny. Why? Because in the interests of national security, they have allowed this bill to get passed. So therefore, the root cause, I think, is beyond POK, Ujjwal. It is more inside Pakistan. It is more inside Islamabad. Okay. Why does India not carry out operations in POK? I'll come back to your state question first. For a long, long time, was because of the way we had signed the agreement that we had signed in 1971, that we will not violate the line of control. One of the reasons why we took such heavy casualties in Kargil, we'll talk about it when we discuss Kargil, was because we had put this self-imposed embargo trying to avoid by the Shimla agreement, whereas Pakistan had crossed the line of control. Why did we have to say we will not cross the line of control? Because of that, we suffered such severe casualties. Now, luckily, all these embargoes have been properly put into the dustbin. We have seen it during the surgical strikes after the Uri attack in September 2016. When we carried out the surgical strikes, we went across to the POK, albeit to a shallow depth. And after the Pulwama attack, now you must have seen, we have gone inside, right deep inside, to go and attack the terror camps which are over there. So I think it is a matter of time. More incidents, more situation. I think that embargo has gone. We are ready to strike inside Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Number one. Second point, Ujjwal, which I will try to bring to your notice, is the 22nd February 1994 resolution, which I had shown to you last time, where there is a resolution of the Parliament that we will take all possible means to recover our territory. I think this is a resolution which we must, as a country, as the people of this country, we must keep reminding ourselves again and again, so that we prepare ourselves to fulfill that resolution. And every incident that we get, every incident that happens, whether it is Pulwama, whether it is Uri, we should treat them as opportunities to go and strike and use those strikes as stepping stones towards fulfillment of this 22nd February 1994 parliamentary resolution. And along with that, obviously, we must keep building our capability to be able to achieve what we need to achieve as per the resolution. I hope that answers your question, Ujjwal.
Thank you, sir. A follow-up to Ujjwal's question, sir, which I have. We did a lot of surgical strikes from Indian independence till now, sir, latest being the Uri surgical strike. Now, how do we strike upon the terror funding, sir? There's a lot of funding which is coming from Pakistan and funding terrorism in India, sir. As Corps Commander, you've had the experience of shutting down a few terror funding hubs, sir. But how do we have a foolproof strategy to completely shut off this terror funding, sir?
Okay, firstly, we have to understand what is the source of the terror funding. Okay, some of the funding is coming straight to the terrorist. Some of the funding is coming through other means, but ultimately filtering down to the terrorist. Okay. Just if I can draw your attention to Afghanistan. Who was funding the whole thing? It was first to begin with US, Saudi Arabia, later on UK came in, China came in, and so like this the number of countries increased for their own political interests, whatever they are. Over here also, for a long, long time, there was funding coming in from various countries. Okay, like Pakistan, of course, directly, literally. Money was coming in from the Middle East. It was being channeled through multiple routes. Through routes, even I would go to the extent of saying education trusts. Okay, now in 2014, as Corps Commander in Kashmir, I had started an exercise where we took the help of an Indian Revenue Service officer. We took his help to make a detailed dossier on this terror funding. Being from Revenue Service, he had that knowledge, and plus he also had some military experience. So basis that, he was able to create a wonderful, shall we say, tracing back of this entire process of funding. So based on that report, to a large extent, based on that report, and of course, substantiated by other inputs, you must have seen for the last about around 2 years, there have been a number of actions which have been taken against the funding that is taking place, whether it is taking place to the terrorists, whether it is taking place to the separatists, that is the Hurriyat leaders, whether it is taking place to some of the other political leaders, some of the other establishments, religious, political, and others. So all of them are, one way or the other, getting affected by it. And one of the reasons that you see that the separatists at least seem to have quietened down in Kashmir quite a bit, it is because of this trying to choke the terror funding. It was a known thing in Kashmir that even that, stone pelting, that patharbazi jo bolte jisko, the stone pelting which was happening over there, the people used to be paid, 150 rupees, 200 rupees for pelting stones for an hour. Okay, it's an organized network. Now, if you see, more or less stone pelting has ended. Why has stone pelting ended? Because the funding has ended. So not only terror, the other means of protest are also, affected by this funding. So it's a very valid question. I think actions are being taken to get at the funding and the channels for funding. The whole process of the trade which takes place through the bus systems across the line of control, that has also been put under a lot of scanner, a lot of testing, a lot of checking. So all of it is showing effect. We are seeing a slightly better situation, and one of the reasons of making things better is choking the flow of funds which is over there.
Thank you so much, sir. It's your perspective planning which led to ending of both terror funding. We have a question from Diksha Singh Katayat, sir. And if I may quote her, "Sir, while discussing about siege of Charair-e-Sharif, if you mentioned that there was one mistake that the media was not allowed and that led to the spreading of false propaganda, sir, even the PM is of the opinion that it's the age of cyber war that is fighting against false propagandas. What is the plan of action of the Indian Army or the Defense Forces in this regard? How is the government and the forces trying to maintain balance between access to internet and spreading of propaganda?"
It's a very, very valid, very valuable question, I think, which Diksha Singh Katayat has asked.
Yes.
And okay, I won't say that we are anywhere near perfection from the government side or from the armed forces or the security forces side, but there has definitely been a lot of improvement. Today, if you see, JNK police have their own Twitter handle. Army's 15 Corps in Kashmir called Chinar. They have their own Twitter handle. The 16 Corps, which is in the Jammu side, so they have Nagrota. They have their own Twitter handle. White Knight. So like this, people are improving. I'm just giving one example. So similarly, they are using other medium also. And one more thing I'm seeing quite positive now is people are coming out, releasing some short videos which are trying to bring out the excesses which are happening because of terrorist violence. Like for example, nobody talks about the innocent civilian Kashmiri Muslims that have been killed by the terrorists. It's just kept quiet. Nobody talks about it. So I think it is important that to bring out such stories so that the truth comes out. So from Charair-e-Sharif, definitely that lesson was learned, that by keeping media out of that place, all kinds of false propaganda was spread. And there are similar instances even from other other theaters where such like terrorist activity and all has taken place. So it is important that people are kept informed, and it is important that we are able to stay ahead of the terrorist releasing information. I recollect again sometime around April 2015. You must have heard of this fellow who became quite infamous, Burhan Wani. His brother was killed in an operation. Okay, they tried to portray as if he's an innocent person. But luckily, we had all the videos of how he was trying to climb up to go and meet his brother, taking three young people with him for getting enrolled. After they came back, those three of them, once the firing started, after they came back, what they stated to the Jammu and Kashmir DSP, that video was on record. So luckily, we were able to release those videos through social media almost instantaneously, and therefore the truth reached out to the people faster than them saying that an innocent has been killed. Because what happens is, at some level, some politician, even mainstream politician, is involved with them, is dependent on them for support, is dependent on them for rallying for whatever cause, whatever interest that may have. So very easily they pick up these threats and they start blaming the security forces. So therefore, unless you are ahead of these people, invariably you are caught on the back foot and you are trying to be defensive. So as I said, it's a very valuable question which you're asking. We have to remain ahead of the propaganda, and that can happen only if you're releasing the information in time. If you don't, if there is vacuum, that vacuum gets filled up by propaganda. It gets filled up by rumor mongering and all kinds of things which are not in our interest, not in the interest of the nation anyway.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Ionaja has a question, sir. Sir, do you think that the political disturbances taking place in India is not only due to internal disputes, but also through the disturbances caused by international elements and terrorist activities?
I think, Ionaja, your question is referring to the farmers' agitation which is going. Okay. And even though you have not stated so, but I am assuming that your question is inspired by that. You know, the kind of support which is happening, if you have been following the news, the fellow who was spotted outside the Indian High Commission in Canada,
Yes.
he's a known Khalistan supporter. So, if you see, who are these elements who are trying to create this trouble? Okay, and if you trace his activities backward, you are sure to see somewhere the path is crossing with the ISI, somewhere the path is crossing with these fundamentalist elements. So you're absolutely right. These disturbances, they invariably sometimes are created by these vested elements. Sometimes, even if they are not created by the vested elements, they take advantage of such a situation to sort of, exploit for the purposes of their own malified intentions and their political agendas. So again, it is important that this is the place, same point which I'm repeating now. It is important that we ensure that we don't give the fertile ground for these things to grow. And the one way, or one simple two words which I want you to remember is, as a country, we have to ensure that there is social cohesion in the country. I think that is uppermost, and we should not get carried away by any kind of rumors, any kind of such, ill-motivated propaganda that carries you to any extremes, disrupting the social cohesion. Because take it from me, ultimately they turn into such protests, and even if it was not started by such elements, it is exploited by such elements in disrupting the situation further.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. So Joel has another question, and I quote, "Can ethical hacking be a good means to tackle terrorism and other related activities?"
Of course. Straightforward answer.
Yeah. Right, sir. I think the army is also starting its new wing, sir, a cyber warfare wing, I believe, sir. So I think we can work towards, fighting terrorism even online, sir. Thank you, sir. Do the participants have any other questions for Sahas, sir?
You must have heard about this dark web.
Dark web.
What is the dark web? It is about all kinds of crime, terror, funding, financing. It's all happening. And there is so little that actually people, I think, ever come to know on what's happening over there. So you just mentioned one small element of cyber warfare in your question, Ujjwal. There are so many things. Today, cyber is I think, most potent threat that anybody is facing. And the amount of investment that our adversaries are doing in these elements of cyber warfare, very little is known I think, in public domain. So this is a very serious one, and I think it is important. It is important that we invest into this field, not only defensive and it was being mentioned, even offensive. It has to be a part of this. You cannot say that, oh, it is not going to be like that good old, we'll not cross the line of control. If somebody is crossing any line of control, why should you hold yourself back?
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. So Diksha Sarma has a question. Sir, may I know your views on incorporating artificial intelligence in fighting terrorism in the country?
Yeah, I think artificial intelligence today is progressively taking charge of everything in our life. So therefore, AI, I think, is going to be of immense importance. And in order to be able to, I think, employ AI effectively, I think most important is to be able to have a very good understanding. Because, see, at the end of the day, as a soldier with many years of experience in the field, I have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of understanding. I have enough background on this subject. Whereas you, perhaps, as a student or as a person who's interested in AI, understand the technical facets, understand the technological capability that AI provides to us. I think it's extremely important that, this operational experience and the technological expertise is converged and brought together onto a common platform from where you strategize and give shape to the potential of AI, whether it is in conventional warfare or it is in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, everywhere. I think AI, why are we looking at AI? We should not be looking at AI only from the point of view of the kinetic, that means the kill factor. We should be looking at AI even to see the attitudes and behavior of the people. It is possible to have more effective communications done. Somebody had asked this question a little while back on the use of communications to deal with terrorism. So I think AI has tremendous potential, tremendous significance, and I think to that extent, our university, the Rashtriya Raksha University, I think is the right platform where we can bring, as I said, operational experience and technological expertise on the table together to be able to devise strategies, techniques, technologies, equipment, and processes to be able to utilize AI effectively for the mission that you have said. It's a wonderful question, Diksha.
Thank you, sir. I think at the RRU we'll be having lot more research projects on these new age warfare. So I think our students of BA Defense and Strategic Studies will have ample opportunities to contribute to research and study in these new age warfares. Thank you, sir. If the participants have any more questions to sir, else we can request the participants to please turn on your cameras for just 10 seconds so that we can take a photo. Request the participants to please turn on your cameras so that we can please take a photo.
Okay, now that I can see more faces, let me use this opportunity to, Saubhagya, you're looking handsome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so let me use this opportunity to announce that next Wednesday, on 16 December at 11 a.m. we are coming in front of you with a wonderful program, which we are calling the Vijay Divas. 16 December, as you know, was the day on which Pakistan Army surrendered to the Indian Army. 93,000 prisoners of war were taken. So Vijay Divas is that. And this year, if you see 2020, is the 49th year of that victory over Pakistan and the liberation of Bangladesh. So on 16 December, we are having a program which we are calling Dawn of the Golden Jubilee of the Liberation War against the 1971 war, call it what you will. So on that day, we are having 2 speakers from Bangladesh who have fought in that war as Mukti Bahini. And we have 3 people at least from the Army, Navy and Air Force, 1 each, recounting their experience of the war. I think it's a golden opportunity for you all to listen in to this wonderful experience that people will be sharing with you. As I look at it, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to hear something like this. And when you see them, when you see their age, I think we have to utilize this few golden moments that are available to us to be able to, reap benefit from it. What our intention here in RRU is, 16 December we will start. Once in a month, we will have a program. We'll try to have it on the 16th of every month, in which we will, first is the overview that we'll have on 16 December now. And once in a month, we will try and cover one battle in detail so that all of you are aware of how that war was fought, how was it won, and so on. So allow me to invite you all. Do not miss it. It's, I think, a fantastic opportunity that we are trying to provide to you. The first of its kind by any academic institution in the country.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for introducing and telling the participants about the program. I hope all the students of BA Defense and Strategic Studies and all the other participants also would join us for this commemoration event. So Saurabh, we have a screenshot, we have a photo.